All right, guys, today we are here with Brian Thornton. He is the president of Pro Riders. And Brian, I'll let you jump right in and tell me who Pro Riders is and what you guys do.
Yeah, so we're a kind of hybrid digital wholesaler. We've kind of started off more as an MGA from the way we've integrated with multiple carriers around cyber insurance. By and large, what that gives us is a single point of entry for cyber where we can then quote multiple carriers quickly, automate the coverage comparison, but the goal is to bring this automated solution to all kind of professional management lines over time.
Okay, perfect. And tell me about yourself. You were kind of telling me you have experience in the cyber world. You've been around the block a time or two. Give me your background in cyber.
Yeah, I'm an old dog in the cyber world. I spent time at AIG, Chubb, Hiscox. I was the tech and cyber practice leader there for a number of years. And so roughly 20 years doing technology, E&O, cyber insurance for large, medium, and small risks. So I've kind of seen it all from that perspective and seen the evolution of this product from the very beginning to kind of where it is today. And so, where we are today is, a tougher market than it's ever been for cyber, but also higher demand. And so having done it for so long, we've seen all size and types of businesses, all types of claims. So we've got, I think, a unique experience when it comes to the table to working with our retailers and kind of helping them educate themselves as well as all their clients about their risks and what the coverages are and, really what they need.
Perfect. So you're the perfect man for this video because as everyone knows, the whole point of this YouTube channel is to educate people. And like you said, the demand for cyber is higher than ever. I've read a lot of articles that say 2022 it's going to be crazier than ever in the history of cyber claims. So let's just start out. Tell me, what is cyber liability insurance?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think, we hear it called cyber liability, and I think that's what it was called from the beginning. I tend to refer to it as cyber insurance, and the only reason I do is because there's really two main components of the coverage. There's first party and third party, and the third party is the liability coverage. And the product evolved out of liability products, so professional liability products, and so that's kind of how it started, and that name kind of stuck. But when we think about the coverage, the majority of the paid claims are first party. So when we think about that, cyber insurance, the one thing I think small or mid-sized businesses have thought in the past is, I don't have a lot of data. So they think about data breaches. They think about Home Depot and Target and all the kind of ones that they've received letters on that, hey, we've lost your info and here's a year's worth of credit monitoring, that type of thing. But it's way beyond that as far as the coverages and the actual exposures that the businesses have. And so that's one component of it, right? It covers businesses if they have a data breach. Okay. And it covers that credit monitoring. It covers the forensics for that firm to come in and figure out what information was accessed, who do you need to notify. It covers the lawyers that are going to advise you every step of the way. And they advise you around your obligations, what regulators you need to notice and what time. They help you craft all the kind of communications, things like that. It's the actual credit monitoring. It's the call services that go with that to answer the calls from your customers or consumers. All that kind of falls under that first party coverage. You also have things like ransomware, which we'll touch on because that's kind of the big thing these days. Mm-hmm. You have cyber crime. Right, social engineering or traditional cyber crime is another kind of first party component that is there. We see those two are the probably biggest claims that we see, beyond data breaches that make the news. And so that's all that first party coverage that's built into this. And then when you get to, and business interruptions, another component of that often out of those claims you see, especially ransomware, you will then see a business interruption piece. And there's also dependent business interruption, which is another piece, which is if you rely on a third party, Amazon, Google, or other smaller third parties that are critical to your business and they go down and you can't conduct business, that's that kind of business interruption piece. And then on the liability side, you've got, defense and indemnity, right? If any customer or customer of a customer sues you because you've had a breach or you had an event, or there's some sort of, privacy liability related issue around what data you store and the protections you have around it, it covers your defense and potential indemnity. Same thing with regulatory investigations. If you have HIPAA related information, so anything healthcare related, any sort of regulatory bodies, a lot of the state attorney generals, any business that's had a breach that affects more than 500 people, typically you need to notify the state attorney general and they might then have an investigation. So that's something that, the legal defense and indemnity related to that, are there for fines and penalties as well as that defense and investigation costs. And then you've got things like PCI fines and assessments. So any business that takes credit cards, that's another component under the liability section. But the defense and indemnity is really important. The defense is the key to make sure that you've got a good law firm behind you that does this for a living. That's all they do, and they'll know exactly how to handle this and what your obligations are, and so they'll make the process more seamless. So that's a little bit about all the coverages that come with these policies, but it is comprehensive for kind of a standalone policy, certainly.
Okay, that's a lot. A lot of stuff there. So let's go into that. You mentioned, like the Home Depot and the Targets and those big companies that always make the news. So I think a lot of people, small businesses, your plumbers, your retail stores, your insurance agencies like ourselves, we say, oh, we're not that big. We don't need cyber insurance. So tell me, what types of businesses need cyber insurance?
Yeah, so it's always a good question. I think, large businesses tend to understand that they have a large corporate exposure. And so if we focus more on kind of the, small to mid-sized business, we do see that resistance. Occasionally people think, well, we don't have a lot of data on employees. We work business to business. We only have X number of customers. They're all... Pretty much any business that's using technology is going to need this in some facet, right? You could certainly make an argument if you're running a cash business that's a babysitting service or a lemonade stand, then likely, hey, maybe you don't need it, right? But that's kind of like the extent of it. So when you think about it, there's even small businesses, they're going to have an exposure to ransomware that if they get hit, it's going to be very difficult for them to recover, to potentially pay the ransom, to rebuild their networks or all the data they had. And small businesses, by and large, get hit with these things where they think they're not a target, but they themselves are not the target. It's known vulnerabilities in software that they're using as the target. And hackers cast a wide net, and it'll smaller businesses that haven't patched properly or haven't moved forward on some of these things tend to be more vulnerable and easier targets. And then when you think about social engineering, this is another space where small businesses tend to get hit, and it's, disproportionately large to their size as far as what they get hit for, right? A small business gets hit and they end up losing $25,000 in a social engineering event. That might be really material to their cash flow. And those are things where you get tricked, and it might not necessarily even be a hack, but you get tricked into paying an invoice, whether that's your funds or customer funds that you hold in your care, custody, and control, where you inadvertently pay an invoice that goes to the wrong place, right? We see it with insurance agencies. We see it with all types of businesses. You get an invoice, it looks like the normal invoice you would get from a carrier. Someone in accounting goes and pays it and finds out that invoice they changed the routing number on it and the bank account number. They didn't double check it. They just sent the money out, and they find out 30 days later that when that carrier comes and says, hey, you never paid this premium. And they say, well, no, we did pay it. And that's when you start to discover what happened. And so really all size businesses, anyone utilizing technology needs it. For businesses that didn't buy in the past, that thought, oh, we don't need it, manufacturing or construction, HVAC plumbers, a lot of times, especially if you're working on corporations or even kind of individuals, consumers, hackers might be using you as the conduit to get into them, right? So we've seen this with hi-fi houses that, set up a home installation of networks and computers, TVs, in-home sound systems. I think, well, we don't really need that because we don't have a huge exposure. We only have X number of clients. And I say, well, they might not be targeting you. They might be targeting your customer. And then when they damage that customer and they trick them into wiring funds out, they're going to then come and sue you and say, hey, you set up my network and you didn't do this properly. So there's, any type of business we could likely make the case. And those that don't have a lot of data, we typically remind them like, hey, if you came in on Monday and you couldn't use your computers or your phones because you got hit with ransomware, like what would you do? And usually small businesses aren't sure where they would go or what they would do. And that's where a policy, a broad policy for a very small business might cost, for $1 million worth of broad coverage, might cost less than $1,000 for the year. So when we kind of put all the exposures out there and then we kind of put it in perspective and then kind of lay out the cost, often, businesses take another look at it and say, okay, for that, we're not prepared. But if I buy this policy, it's going to give me access to all the right vendors that are going to help me recover, and that's kind of worth it at the end.
Got it. Okay, that all makes sense. So really the short answer is if you're in business, 99 out of 100 businesses, you probably need cyber.
Yes.
Okay, easy enough. So tell me, and you touched on this a little bit with all the different coverages. Tell me, let's just focus on 2 or 3 of the most important coverages that you should be looking for when you're shopping for a cyber insurance policy.
Yeah, so I would say that, even for a small business, a lot of times what they'll see is this gets kind of rolled into a little sublimit that's attached to a BOP. I would be looking at standalone coverage that's an individual policy for starters. because anyone that's offering a standalone policy is likely going to be much more broad and comprehensive as far as the coverage is holistically. And they're likely going to have a dedicated claims team behind it that's all they do, and a set of vendors that they've already pre-negotiated everything with and got it set up. So just by default, by saying focus on a standalone policy, you're likely going to get better coverage and better service, and certainly a dedicated claims person that knows what they're doing. For small to mid-sized businesses, I would specifically say it's worth checking on whether the policy is reimbursement or pay on behalf. And the reason we mention that, and that I would look at that specifically related to ransomware as well, because sometimes it's different for different parts of the policy, especially when you have first and third and different coverages. Ransomware is tricky because for a small business, you might not have the money to pay. Right? You might not have the available cash flow. It's really hard to try to get a bridge loan when you say, what are you going to do with this? And you say, we're going to go buy a bunch of Bitcoin to go pay a bunch of people that are holding us ransom. Like, good luck.
Right.
So if the carrier is going to pay that on your behalf and they agree that it's covered and they agree it's in the best interest and they've double checked with all the attorneys that you can legally make this payment, which is another component of what happens with these policies. That coverage specific to, it's got to have ransomware, but I would look for a small business to make sure that it's pay on behalf as opposed to reimbursement, so that you're not paying that and then waiting to be reimbursed because you may not have the funds to make that payment. So that's ransomware is probably one of the bigger ones. I would say on the business interruption side is the last kind of component, to make sure that it covers beyond just internet revenue and that it covers your holistic business interruption out of any cyber event, not only your own cyber event, but any third parties that you rely on. And that's that dependent business interruption that I think can get overlooked in some of these policies as well.
Okay, perfect. Those are all good ones. So let's talk about this. I think a lot of times these businesses, they're like, oh, great, 15 years ago, cyber insurance didn't exist. These insurance companies are just thinking of ways to make more money from me. Why am I going to pay a premium for cyber insurance? So tell me, how expensive is cyber insurance? And obviously it differs from company to company, the amount of records you have and whatnot, but is it fairly expensive compared to a normal business owner's policy? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, in the small to mid-sized space, it's remained, in my view, very affordable. It's, one of those things, if you look at a traditional small professional service company, that could be a CPA, it could be a lawyer, it could be a plumber, general contractor. If they have, say, $1 million in revenues and they're looking for $1 million limit, it's likely going to cost them under $1,000 per year. If you start getting into, hey, we've got $5 million in revenue, then maybe it's more like $1,500, $1,800 for the year for broad coverage with a low deductible. And so I feel like those are generally affordable given what the coverage is and what the exposures are. You can always look at lower limits, $500,000, but typically even for a small business, we look at it and say that the premium savings to go lower than $1 million doesn't really add up, right? It might be $800 as opposed to $1,000. At that point, you might as well get the full coverage. Larger businesses, it's going to be certainly more expensive, but it's the business is still kind of rated on revenues and then all of your compensating controls around your cybersecurity posture, as well as your industry, right? And the industry is critical because that's one of the main factors that would change kind of your rating basis. And so that will kind of determine ultimately what your cost looks like. Okay,
perfect. So this is all great information. I have one last question for you, not to put you on the spot here, but do you have any, we've talked about Home Depot, Target, all those ones that we know the real world examples of, but those are larger companies. A lot of these smaller companies, as we talked about, say, hey, that doesn't pertain to me. Do you have any real world examples of cyber claims for your small to mid-sized businesses?
Yes, all day, every day. We've got, usually when we're working with our brokers, we'll specifically ask, like, what business are you talking to, and let us know. So if it's a law firm versus a CPA versus, pick any other class of business, just a mom and pop retail shop, typically we'll say, tell us the class, and then we'll come back to you with a couple of claims examples that are real world claims examples that we've seen or have been newsworthy, but still small to mid-sized firms that are kind of more atypical of what people are going to see. And so, yes, we have plenty of them. We see these claims all the day. Every day we see claims kind of come in one way or the other. And so I would say yes. We'll always have examples that are going to be real world examples. And we've pre-tailored a bunch of those for our brokers to say, hey, in these top 10 classes that we see the most, professional service categories, construction, manufacturing, here's a bunch of real world examples. But likely if someone gets into something more granular, we can come up with real world examples that we can then provide on the spot that'll show them, hey, this is what your peer got hit with. And a lot of in the underwriting process that will come up as far as benchmarking around people in this industry code with this revenue band. This is typically the limits they're purchasing, so that you can kind of see what other people of your size and industry have purchased. But then it usually comes with claims examples for that size company and that industry code, so that we've got something tangible for them to look at and say, this is one of your peers that got hit, and you can kind of see what it looked like.
Got it. So bottom line, it's happening every day to your every normal day business.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of this that doesn't make the news, that are smaller events that still are time consuming and disruptive for the end business, that don't necessarily make the newspapers.
Got it. Perfect. Okay. Well, this is great, Brian. Thank you for the information. And I'll include ProWriter's information down below. You guys can check them out. Of course, for us, if you have any questions, we're always happy to answer. But bottom line, if you're in business, you need cyber insurance, especially going into the year 2022. It's going to happen sooner or later. So protect yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having me.